Hi, everyone, and welcome to the IBTTA webinar, Keeping Pace, the Financial Effects of a New Travel and Commuting Landscape on Toll Agencies. I'm Pat Jones. This webinar and others like it is part of IBTTA's ongoing effort to provide robust content to you, our members, during these challenging times when we're not yet able to meet in person. We encourage you to explore the full range of IBTTA meetings on the website at ibtta.org and by clicking on events. We have 380 people registered for today's webinar. I think that's a testimony to the excellent expertise that we have here. We are recording this webinar for later broadcast on YouTube. We will be taking your questions during this webinar. We encourage you to use the chat function on your screen to ask questions or make a comment at any time. And you have the option to use only panelists or all panelists and attendees. So please, at any time during the webinar, feel free to use the chat function to make comments or ask questions of the panelists. Now I'm pleased to introduce the moderator for today's event. Michael Lexton is a managing director and head of transportation banking at UBS. During his 40-year career in public finance, Michael has focused exclusively on transportation infrastructure and has led financings for some of the most innovative and complex projects in the country. These include financings for over a dozen different toll agencies, ranging from large established turnpikes to startup toll roads and projects using public-private partnerships. Michael, it's great to see you. Thanks to you and your colleagues for organizing this webinar. You have the floor. Michael, you're on mute.
Thank you, Pat.
Okay.
And a special thanks to IBTTA for organizing today's event. To the nearly 400 participants who have registered, we're thrilled by the turnout and we appreciate the time that you've taken to participate. As Pat mentioned, my name is Michael Lexton. I'm head of UBS's Transportation Group, and I'll be moderating today's Keeping Pace panel discussion on the financial effects of a new travel and commuting landscape on toll agencies. For the panel today, I am joined by a distinguished and diverse group, and we'll hear a lot of different perspectives. First up will be my colleague from UBS, Eric Galinsky. Eric is an executive director in UBS's Transportation Group, where he provides banking services. He has over 15 years of dedicated transportation finance expertise across all modes of transportation, and he also helps our business development with project sponsors and developments for P3 financings. Following Eric, we'll have two toll agency representatives from each coast. Donna Manueli has served as the CFO of the New Jersey Turnpike Authority since 2010. She's been with the authority for more than 25 years, holding various positions of increasing responsibility in the organization, including controller and assistant controller. On the left coast, we have the CFO from the Transportation Charter Agencies, Amy Potter. The TCA designed and built and manages California's largest network of toll roads. Amy joined TCA in 2004 and has more than 30 years of experience in the public and private sector in audit, taxation, business process, and improvement and strategic planning. She was also responsible for the 2014 debt restructuring that placed the agencies in a long-term financially stable and sustainable position. Following the toll agency representatives, we'll have a representative from credit agency. Cherian George is managing director and head of the Americas in Fitch Ratings Global Infrastructure and Project Finance Group. He manages ratings and analysis on public-private partnership and project finance transactions in the Americas, including the transportation, public and social infrastructure, sports, energy, and industrial sectors. Then we'll get a point of view from traffic and revenue consultant. Cameron Kahn is a senior vice president leading CDM Smith's Transportation Finance and Technology Group. He has more than 32 years of professional experience and has extensive background in toll-related studies. Cameron is most familiar with travel data composition, toll travel demand modeling for existing and new toll facilities, interstates and managed lanes, toll revenue forecasting, financial feasibility, and cost-benefit studies. And then the final speaker will give us a perspective as a private company toll operator. Ricardo Sanchez Gomez is Cintra's VP of Operations for North America and Australia. He has more than 20 years of experience in transportation engineering, focused on analyzing traffic, revenue, and pricing for toll road projects. He has been leading Cintra's North American technical department and has been an integral part of Cintra's managed lanes projects from procurement to implementation to operations. As Pat mentioned, in terms of format, each of our speakers will spend a few minutes discussing their respective topics, and then we'll dive into Q&A. We have a few questions as the moderator that I have prepared, and then we'll start taking questions from the audience, as many as we have time for in the 90 minutes that's been allotted. So again, we're excited to hear from everybody. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Eric Galinsky, to set the stage with some important data gathered by the UBS Evidence Lab. Eric?
Thanks, Michael. And thank you to Pat Jones, Wanda Clayman, and IBTTA for organizing this webinar and the opportunity to share the UBS Evidence Lab data. The UBS Evidence Lab is a sell-side team of experts that work across 45 specialized labs creating insight-ready data sets. The experts turn data into evidence by applying a combination of tools and techniques to harvest, cleanse, and connect billions of data items each month. The library is designed to help investors and, of course, toll operators to answer the questions that matter to their investment analysis and operations. And as such, the Evidence Lab has produced a variety of recent work on the impact of COVID-19 crisis on the transportation and infrastructure space. Turning to slide 2, as the COVID-19 pandemic unfolded, we expected toll road credits to be well positioned to weather the unprecedented mobility restrictions and demand shock generated as a result of the outbreak based on their essential demand floors and strong liquidity positions headed into the crisis. Based on data from the Evidence Lab, this theory was quickly proven as we observed traffic rebounding to pre-COVID levels in as few as 6 weeks, as restrictions have been lifted in Germany and New Zealand, providing potential benchmarks for recovery in the United States. In the US, most toll agencies have been reporting gradual improvements in traffic through June after declines of up to 90% in April. However, the gap between the US and the peer group of Germany, New Zealand, and Canada appears to be widening. In the US, we continue to observe a somewhat inverse correlation between congestion levels and the population of a metropolitan area, with many smaller cities demonstrating higher levels of congestion than larger cities, and the rebound in commercial traffic has outpaced passenger traffic. Going forward, we expect that toll roads, bridges, and tunnels that compete with heavily used public transit systems may benefit from commuters shifting their travel mode away from transit and taking advantage of falling congestion. To mitigate the impact of decreased revenues, most toll roads should have more flexibility to defer maintenance, reduce capital expenditures, and cut operating expenses relative to other transportation sectors. Some direct operational measures we have seen to date have included the suspension of cash collection, acceleration of existing plans to transition to all electronic tolling, closing customer service centers, rest areas, suspending construction, and suspending toll collection. We have seen a few toll roads consider accelerating construction as well to take advantage of reduced daytime traffic conditions. From a credit perspective, publicly managed established toll roads remain well positioned due to their robust liquidity and coverage levels and inherent market strengths heading into this demand shock. Managed lanes will likely experience a slower recovery as congestion slowly rebounds, though many newer assets are still in the ramp-up phase of their debt service. Nonetheless, as long as essential movement of people and goods continues to be permitted, there should be a demand floor for most toll roads which will support their ability to manage through short-term traffic and revenue declines while maintaining long-term credit quality. On the next 3 slides, we present global mobility data from the UBS Evidence Lab focusing on traffic congestion, public transit ridership, and foot traffic. Using data from 500 million plus TomTom software-driven navigation devices globally, the UBS Evidence Lab provides daily congestion traffic metrics across 50 regions and 400 plus cities that can be used to help quantify how COVID-19 has shifted traveler behavior and monitor the longevity of the shift. Here, congestion is defined as the difference in time required for a journey as compared to a period of free-flowing traffic. The public transit data tracks the use of public transportation in 105 cities within 32 countries compared to normal mobility, typically relative to pre-COVID ridership as of January 15, 2020. This data is sourced from Move It, the leading global public transport app with over 750 million active users. Finally, foot traffic data is sourced from Google Community reports and mobile phone movements permissioned by the user. We can identify mobility trends for specific places like grocery markets, parks, transit stations, retail, residential, and workplaces. As detailed on slide 3, the America's US auto congestion, public transit, and foot traffic to work continue to recover. There have been lagging recoveries in Canada. The impact of high levels of infection and hospitalization rates in the Americas can be seen in other countries, for example, the stalled recovery in auto congestion in Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. Moving to slide 4, the recovery in Europe has outpaced the Americas, with auto congestion returning to pre-pandemic levels in Germany and a strong rebound in transit in France, Italy, and Spain. Moving on to slide 5, in Asia Pacific, congestion and transit is approaching pre-COVID levels in Japan and Australia. In many major metropolitan areas in the US, transit is closely linked or even supported by local toll systems. As detailed on slide 6, public transit agencies across the US are facing several major challenges. First, there has been a dramatic decline in fare revenue due to ridership declines of 60 to 90%. Second, there has been a reduced stream of dedicated tax revenues due to the reduced economic activity and rising unemployment. Finally, there have been increased costs due to more frequent cleaning of vehicles, facilities, the need for protective gear for employees, as well as emergency staffing. The path to recovery remains unclear even after social distancing measures are relaxed, as the general public may still be hesitant to utilize public transit, opting instead to rely on personal vehicles or telecommuting. Slide 7 tracks the social distancing gap that we have expected to develop as the apprehension with the use of public transit should hinder the pace of recovery relative to congestion. We clearly see this in Germany, where the social distancing gap has averaged 40 percentage points over the last month, despite loosened restrictions. In the US, the social distancing gap was as high as 10 percentage points in May, but has disappeared in June as the traffic rebound appears to have slowed relative to transit ridership. Finally, on slide 8, we recently polled 14 major investors and asked them about their views on the sector and how COVID-19 might affect their buying interest. The results are presented here, but clearly show a strong differentiation between assets and continued strong interest in toll credits as we have seen in recent pricing. With that, I'll hand it back to Michael for the additional presenters.
Thank you, Eric. We'll now turn it over to Donna.
Oh, wrong. Hold on. What the heck is? Hold on. Okay, why is this? Okay, I think we have it now. Can everyone see my screen? You guys good? Okay. Good morning. Thank you all for being with us today, and I'm happy to bring you a little up to date on what's been going on at the New Jersey Turnpike Authority. Oh, yeah. This is not working.
Hey, Donna, do you want me to?
Yes, it's not moving for me, sorry.
Okay. Hey, Donna, this is Kristen. I'm going to put up your slides and I'll advance it for you. Give me 1 second.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm good, Kristen. Okay, sorry about that. Anyway, I just want to start. 2020 was looking so bright for the New Jersey Turnpike Authority and kind of take you to where we were back in January and February. Our first ever strategic plan, which was adopted in August of 2019, was being implemented. We were in phase 2 of a major service area renovation program after a successful phase 1 brought Shake Shack and Chick-fil-A to the roads, and a 30+% increase in sales at the service areas. A $28 million renovation to the PNC Arts Center was nearing completion with a robust 2020 summer concert schedule planned by Live Nation. Our traffic and revenue were ahead of projections. Our expenses were down. We had virtually no snow, and the board authorized public hearings for a long-range capital plan and toll increases to support the financing of the plan. Life was good. Things were looking good. We were very excited around here for what the future held for the Turnpike, and then came March. And it brings you a little bit of the impact on the timeline of the COVID-19 events and our traffic and revenue. Key first date, March 9th, Governor Murphy declared a state of emergency, and that's when we saw the beginnings of our traffic and revenue decline. March 21st, the governor issued a statewide stay-at-home order, another very significant date. March 23rd, we began working remotely. March 24th, we suspended cash toll collection. And as all those things happened, we saw our revenues decline and decline and decline. The week of April 6th was really the bottom, the largest declines. You can see the month of April, we were down almost 62% in revenue compared to the year before, but then we had slow improvement after that. We began resuming cash collection May 18th. June 9th, the governor lifted his stay-at-home order. And something I want to point out, April was the bottom, as I said, 62% decline in revenue. In June, that decline had improved to 24%. Year to date, we're down about 27% from 2019. So this is a little bit about the New Jersey Turnpike. We operate both the New Jersey Turnpike and the Garden State Parkway, as I'm sure you are aware. Some different dynamics we saw on the roadways. So on the Turnpike, in April, passenger car traffic was down 75%. But our commercial traffic, which is shown on the right, was down about 26%. I have to say that the authority, and especially John Keller, our executive director, Diane Scicchetti, our chairperson, worked very closely with the trucking industry in constant contact. We did leave service areas open for basic services. And I think, that the truckers stayed on our roads. In fact, what we saw was especially 5-axle trucks, their trips lengthened. So our average toll actually increased. And I'm going to be happy to report to the board next week that in June, we actually had $1 million more in commercial toll revenue than we did in June of 2019. And we really think that's remarkable. As you see, our passenger car traffic was down about 37% in June, but commercial up 3.4, $1 million, and from the loss of $8 million in April. So these are really good signs. And what we've seen is, we've got about a 70-30 split between passenger and commercial, and the commercial traffic has been stronger, and that's been helping our numbers. Now for the Garden State Parkway, different type of road. This is a barrier system as opposed to a ticket system, but it's mostly all passenger cars. And we see in April, the Parkway was down 67% in toll revenue. That's improved to a decline of 21% in June. But interestingly enough, even commercial vehicles on the Parkway, they're about flat with last June. So we're seeing, again, a much stronger usage and less impacts on the commercial vehicles as well. What's also been helping the Parkway is we've had some good weather, especially on the weekends. And once the stay-at-home order was lifted, we've seen lots of people getting out and about, especially to the Jersey Shore. So that has also helped the June numbers. You see we're only down about 22% in passenger car traffic in the month of June. One thing we have been, I guess, back in maybe the end of March, early April, CDM Smith, our traffic engineering consultants, did a projection for us about what they expected our toll revenue losses to be. So this was done very early in the game. In addition, as part of our toll increase hearings, they included the COVID impacts in their study. So we have the benefit of having some projections to work with. And we're happy to report that through June, April, May, and June, because they were the first 3 months of the COVID projection period, we've actually outperformed the CDM Smith projections. So Cameron, good job. We'd like you to be conservative. We hope that your projections are conservative for the remainder of the period, but we've outperformed them by about almost 11%. You can see the Parkway has really outperformed the numbers. I'm not sure that anyone could have predicted the great weather that we had. There's been very few instances of rainstorms. So people have been going to the Jersey Shore and other outdoor places that the Parkway takes you. So you see the Parkway has really outperformed. As far as this year, we're expecting to be down about 28% due to our COVID-19 losses. Just for COVID-19 is about a 28% decline in revenue. The COVID-19 impacts were expected to continue over the next 2 years, although declining each year, about a 6% reduction in revenue for 2021 for COVID and 3% in 2022. Traffic is not expected to get back to 2019 levels until 2025. However, once you get past 2022, you're at less than 1% impact. And luckily for us, our COVID-19 losses will be more than offset by the additional revenue from the toll increase. So while I'm talking about 28% decline in 2020, that's our COVID losses. We will not be down 28% because we have a toll increase going in effect in September 13th. What's wrong with this slide? Okay, so a couple of things that we sort of learned through this period or as we're studying our data that either gave us more questions or validated some of the things we thought. Our tolls by mail payment rates were lower than we expected, even without fees. Turnpike, they didn't pay any better than the violators. The Parkway, they paid slightly better. And what was surprising is our cash customers went back to paying as soon as collectors were in the lane. So these are people who wanted to pay, they just don't want to pay by mail. So we'll have to study that. Parkway collections were better than the Turnpike. Maybe it's more in-state customers, maybe because it's more cars than trucks, maybe because the tolls are lower, maybe it's a structure, a barrier toll versus a closed system, and in a closed system, at exit, we have to guess where you got on. So maybe that kind of affected the payment rate. We're not sure, but we'll be studying those things as we get more data. Commercial traffic. I've talked about the importance of the commercial traffic and its rebound, and I think it's proven, and we've pointed this as a credit strength, but over 30% of the Turnpike revenue is commercial, and it really validates what a credit strength that is. Parkway, mainly a commuter road, would have expected that it would have really been impacted by this. However, the leisure travel and seasonal part of it has been proven to be vital during the pandemic. And our traffic declines were consistent with other parts of the country, and that surprised us a bit because we are at the epicenter. New Jersey was hit very hard, so was New York. New York was the epicenter, and being so close and dependent upon the commuting between the two, we would have expected that we would have done worse than the rest of the country. So again, I think it says a lot about the strength of our region. Besides toll revenue, non-toll revenue has been impacted. Every bit of our revenue has been impacted. You know, Easy Pass fees are down. The federal government, the IRS was not opening mail for months. So we have not received the $38 million BAB payment that was due to us July 1st, as if I needed to have more cash flow declines. The IRS is helping with that. Service areas, they were impacted worse, I think, than our traffic declines. And so it's unlikely we'll get more than the guaranteed minimum rent. Investment income is down. Or we get money from the Arts Center, from the Live Nation. All their shows have been canceled. So pretty much every single revenue source has softened a bit. What's our 2020 outlook? I mean, we have resilience in the face of adversity. Richard Stockton, Forked River, Vince Lombardi service areas have all reopened after renovation during the pandemic. The pre-COVID proposed toll increase was approved. We'll be able to maintain our bond-funded projects throughout COVID and beyond, and we're going to meet all our bond covenants. We've had challenges to cash flow, and as I've discussed, all our revenue sources, not just toll, have been impacted. So we were never in jeopardy of not covering debt service, but what was in jeopardy is some of our more discretionary reserve funding, some of our pay-go capital funding. So what we did for this is we did a direct placement bond refunding. We funded about $176 million of principal payments that were coming due on 1/1/21, and we pushed them out a bit. We were very successful in that. I think the total NPV cost is about $3 million. I mean, it's essentially break even, and it gave us the relief that we needed. We've also, you know, controlled our operating expenses. We think we're going to be at least $40 million under our budget. And we've also, you know, deferred some discretionary pay-go capital, but those are minor projects. Our major capital programs are all intact, all moving forward. In fact, we have, as Eric pointed out, we have been ones who have been taking advantage of reduced volumes to get more work done out on the road, so more of our maintenance reserve work. So we've actually accelerated that. So the things that we deferred, again, I would describe as more minor capital projects. The outlook for 2021 and beyond, you know, look, we are committed to our long-range capital program. We're looking to issue about $1 billion of bonds each year to fund it. We're always looking for opportunities to refund additional bonds for more savings. So I have the opportunity, I can, you know, take some savings and put them up front if I need to, which will give us flexibility in case there's a second wave of COVID or we don't continue to meet our projections. You know, we'll continue to look at all our discretionary funding of smaller projects. And, you know, we continue to run cash flow scenario after cash flow scenario and consider all of our options. I want to say, like, we know how to manage a large capital program in the face of adversity. Our last toll increase was approved in October of 2008, and you all know what happened after that. But we were able to deliver a $7 billion capital program after the financial crisis and the Great Recession. So here we are, May 2020, the board approves toll increase and long-range capital plan, and we've got our challenges ahead, but you know, we feel like we know what we need to do. And I'm glad that I'm a toll road right now and not a public mass transit agency. That's all I have to say, so thank you.
Great, thank you, Donna. That was a very comprehensive overview of the Turnpike Authority's situation and your plans going forward. And with that, we'll travel out west and introduce Amy Potter, the CFO of Transportation Corridor Agencies.
Great. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, IBTTA, for inviting me to be part of this panel today. Let's go to the next slide, please. So the Transportation Corridor Agencies is made up of two separate joint powers authorities, the Foothill Eastern and the San Joaquin Hills. And as you see on the map there, the Foothill Eastern in green consists of the 241, 261, and 133 toll roads. And then the San Joaquin Hills in gold is the 73. And the system was built to exist parallel to the highly congested alternatives, the I-5, 405, and 55. And what we've seen, which is really interesting during this period of COVID, where the free alternatives are essentially wide open, or were wide open at a point in time, we still had quite a bit of traffic that was, I would say, choices other than as an alternative to congestion. And so what we've found is that there may be areas within the system where the drivers just find it maybe more convenient to use the roads. We don't have the same truck traffic as Donna had suggested that they have on the East Coast. So really it is just that daily choice. We converted to all electronic tolling in 2014. So at least we weren't in that type of position where we had to worry about the cash collection. Everything had already been in place and things operating smoothly with regard to that. Prior to COVID, our system was experiencing about 325,000 transactions a day and 380 million in annual toll revenue. So next slide, please. And so then, just like the rest of the systems and what everyone else has experienced, we started to see our traffic decline about the second week of March. And as those COVID measures increased, so initially the schools closed down here, and then some businesses started to telework. And then when the governor's orders came out and more businesses were forced to close, that's when we hit bottom, right around the same time that Donna had showed you happened on the East Coast. And so the Foothill Eastern traffic declined and bottomed out pretty much at about a 64% decline. And the San Joaquin Hills declined further to about 75%. And one of the things I think may have occurred with the San Joaquin Hills, and I didn't point out on the map when we were there, but the Orange County Airport is at the north end of the San Joaquin Hills. And in addition to just being a reliever to the congested 405 and 5, the San Joaquin Hills, the 73, would also get a lot of traffic to and from the airport. And then also those who are traveling to Southern California, taking trips from Orange County south to San Diego. And so with the situation currently, we're missing some of that traffic. So then beginning in late April, we started seeing transactions increase week over week as those businesses started to reopen. And I have seen some signs of some softening in recent weeks, but not too extreme. And we're just watching that carefully. Next slide. And so here is the pattern of traffic that we saw on the Foothill Eastern, starting at the 100%, and then these numbers representing the percentage of that transactional toll revenue, the pre-COVID numbers. And we did have a little bit of, you see the dip there down to 31%. That I didn't consider the bottom related to COVID. We had an extremely heavy rain week, which in Southern California, we don't get a lot of rain like that. And people tend to just stay indoors during those periods. But then you can see the pattern here of the increases up to a 69% of those pre-COVID revenue numbers as of the week ended June 21st. Next slide, please. And then San Joaquin, very similar pattern, just that it hit a little bit lower numbers, and so hasn't come back to as high as the Foothill Eastern, but definitely the same pattern. Next slide, please. So we had already started our budget process, put together our forecasts. We're working on some plans similar to what Donna had expressed. We were in a really good position. We had some plans for some capital projects and We were very strong financially, and then all of a sudden, this COVID came along. And so we had to relook at our budget process, and we took a very, very conservative approach. And so what we did, and I'll show you in a moment, the forecasting approach that we took for our revenue. But with the very conservative revenue, we also then cut our expense budget very extreme, and really just focused on core operating expenditures and initiatives that we had already had in place and that were really just important for the business to carry forward, but deferring a lot of the other things just until we get to the point where we could see what the actual duration of COVID would be and what those true longer term impacts may be. And so with part of this, and so really just wanted to focus there though on how we really were very well positioned to handle the situation. So similar to what Donna was expressing, we have very strong liquidity, and we took a lot of measures, done all the right things. And so even though we're in unprecedented times here, and we're really being very cautious, we are able to meet all of our covenants. Next slide, please. And so the approach we took with the forecast for our revenue for our fiscal year 21 budget is we had already worked with our traffic and revenue consultant on a forecast pre-COVID. And so then what we did is we looked at various scenarios. And so we presented some of those scenarios to our board and decided to pick one that we think is very conservative, which we called our middle duration scenario, which starts with or assumes a very slow recovery and then to recession levels by the end of our fiscal year 21, June 21. As of now, though, we're already exceeding those assumptions that are in that forecast. Next slide, please. And so here is the Foothill Eastern revenue forecast shown in green. And you can see there that when we were developing the forecast, traffic had already declined. And so our revenue was at essentially 35% of our pre-COVID forecast that we would have utilized. And so we assumed that we would not start to recover from that until mid to late July. And then you can see a very slow recovery from there. And then up to pretty extreme recession numbers by the end of the year. And shown in red, that's where we've been. And so we're exceeding that forecast, which then just gives me the confidence that we probably have a very conservative forecast. And so if there are further dips, that we should be able to meet our numbers. In fact, we'll probably exceed them. Next slide, please. And San Joaquin was the same situation. And so what we told our board when we put together our budget is that we were going to take this very conservative approach and that we would likely need to come back during the year to amend our budget. Next slide, please. And so moving forward, what we're planning to do is just to continue to implement those sound financial practices that we think are what put us in a really good position to be able to withstand this situation. And then also, as I've shown you, the traffic and revenue is currently exceeding our conservative forecast. So we will just continue to monitor and then amend our budget if needed. And then we will continue to assess those potential impacts to our longer term forecasts. We've been doing stress testing. And then, of course, when we get to a point where we think we are maybe to the end of COVID and we can really analyze the longer term impacts, we'll take those into consideration. And so with that, I'll turn it back to Michael.
Great, thank you, Amy. That was a great perspective and overview of what's going on with your agencies. So now we'll take kind of a broader view of the credit impacts and what bond issuers may be looking at, and certainly how bond investors will react based on what the rating agencies are saying. And from that, we have the perspective from Fitch Ratings from Cherian George. Cherian?
Thank you, Michael. Hello, everybody. It's really good to be on the call with you. I hope you can hear me okay. Let me just go ahead. First of all, thank IBTTA for the opportunity to present today. And hopefully you can see my screen. So I will provide an economic and credit perspective on COVID-19. One of the things that many of you may not be that familiar with is how we approach ratings. Fitch does something that we call rating through the cycle. And if you think through what a typical cycle is, you have a period of time and you have actually good economic times and not so good economic times. And this is effectively how things play out typically. And what we're trying to do is to have ratings that are pretty much stable through that cycle. So when we assign the rating, we're thinking about it in that context. So, and particularly as we're going into a cycle, one of the things that we are focused on is what is the cycle going to look like and what is the exit point from that cycle. And so if you look at an issuer, for example, issuer A that actually is performing quite well during good times and then goes through a cycle, what we are then trying to project, because we don't know this at the time, is what in fact that exit point might be. And as long as it's within the range of where we think the exit point should be for the typical issuer, and then that the metrics that are achieved they may be slightly on the lower end, but close to the levels that would be consistent with the rating, we would likely maintain the rating. Clearly, if the margins are higher, the ratings would be stable. If the margins are a little more compressed, in that window of time, we might actually put them on a negative outlook, or if there's some uncertainty to the trajectory of recovery, we might put them on a negative outlook. And clearly, the closer they get to the margins, they could go on a rating watch. Or, as this example shows you, if you in fact have an issuer that is likely not to recover to a level that is consistent, this would be an argument for a downgrade. So one of the things that this chart shows you also is, the extent of the cycle matters. And we are going through something right now with COVID-19 that clearly none of us anticipated. So one of the things that we had to think about was what would, you're probably going to see in 2020, and some of the examples that have been discussed today just show you the strength of the agencies, particularly the ones in the US that have that flexibility. But many entities are going to have metrics that are materially worse than they would have planned on, and materially potentially worse than the rating trigger scenarios. So we made a conscious decision that really what mattered more was liquidity in the crisis. How will they get through the period of dislocation? And more importantly, how they would look like in 2022 when we as a company think, some of these entities should be exiting and the recovery should be well on its way. And there are some assumptions that are in that, given that it'll depend on the extent of how things play out over the next year. So moving on to Fitch's economic perspectives, clearly we are projecting a reduction in GDP that's far greater than anything in the last 30 to 50 years that we've experienced, and we expect a recovery in 2021. It's an assumption that there'll be a vaccine and that our ability to get back to day-to-day life will improve. But clearly, it's not expected to be a robust V-shaped recovery. There are going to be some headwinds along the way. Unemployment is clearly going to be higher. It's extremely high now. It'll drop, and the average for the year is projected at about 9.4% by the end of the year. But it's expected to remain somewhat elevated, and you'll see a chart in a moment. Inflation is important, particularly because for toll road entities, the ability to price your facilities is linked to inflation, and clearly inflation will be on the lower end for the near term. So that does put some pressure. And when you look at, we also operate in a global economy, and what happens globally affects us. The Fitch view on the globe is GDP in 2020 would decline by 4.5%, which is quite significant. But there would be a more robust recovery overall globally, and that's probably more reflective of the developing or emerging markets than it is the developed market. What's interesting in the chart on the right that you see is clearly volatility has historically been greater in the emerging markets, but in the two major crises we've seen in the last 10 years, the volatility in the developed markets has been quite significant also. So it's just something to watch. We still think that emerging markets will have more volatility, but it's just something to watch. And clearly unemployment is an important indicator given the impact on jobs and commuting, which affects toll roads. So the fact that there's going to be a significant increase in unemployment is something to watch. So what did we do at Fitch? At Fitch, we decided to take a look back in March at what we thought were a few different cases that could play out. So we developed what is called the rating case. The base cases are typically in normal times our normal expectation for performance. And our rating case incorporates some of the material risks that we see for a particular entity, right? It's through the cycle risks, right? We don't assume the worst case, for example. So in some ways, when you look at the rating case, and you'll see a chart in a moment, where it'll basically show you a decline and a recovery, which is probably closer to what, at this point, what our base case might look like. So we are not assuming that the bottom falls out. We did run a couple of downside cases. The first one looked at not just a quarter of lockdowns, which was effectively in our rating case. We actually assumed the net impact of 2 quarters of lockdowns, mainly because we were really unsure as to how these things might play out. And we actually were unsure about, lockdowns and then opening up and potential lockdowns again, or partial lockdowns, some of which we are seeing signs of right now. And then in the severe downside case, we really took that downside case and assumed, listen, let's assume that plays out. What happens if the recovery is very slow? And so it almost, in some sense, began to bookend the risk, because it's a pretty severe scenario when you think about the severe downside. There are assumptions here. These are available in some reports that we have, and I'll mention in a moment. So if you need them, you will be able to get access to them. Just to give you a snapshot of, there's a global audience that is the membership of IBTTA. So I want to provide a little bit of perspective relatively on how things are expected to perform. And you see the US having a significant decline in 2020, but performing better than particularly the UK and the Eurozone. And the growth trajectory is marginally stronger. And you actually see on the opposite end, the UK being more vulnerable, and clearly on the lower end in terms of the declines, and also in terms of the nature of the recovery. And this is important because this then informs our scenarios. These are the 2 bookends that I talked about. The dotted line at the top is the Fitch rating case, and it assumes the declines we were expecting and a recovery into 2022. Clearly, in certain markets, the trajectory of the line that you see will be stronger or slightly weaker, depending on the strength of the recovery. So this is just an illustration. And then you see the impacts of the double whammy that we included in the severe downside, which is extended lockdowns in 2020, and then just pretty much a linear growth, assuming, there is a concern here with the tremendous demand destruction that is taking place, particularly with small and medium-sized businesses, which is unlike any scenario we've gone through before. So what the impact of that will be is really unknown. Even economists will tell you that really it's hard to predict. We may think it's going to come back stronger, but it may not. My general feeling is that the current indications tell me that things are possibly going to be slightly worse than they're going to be worse than the rating case, possibly. But we'll have to see how it plays out, but less likely that it will go all the way down to the severe downside case, because think about the impact of that 25% reduction. When you think about GDP dropping by 5 to 6, 7%, something in that range, it's highly unlikely. And clearly, then the issue will be the trajectory of the recovery from possibly somewhere in between these lines and heading out, and that trajectory will possibly drive some of the rating decisions going forward. So one of the things that 2020 points out is the significance of liquidity, and both Donna and Amy pointed out the liquidity that they had in their transactions. It's been extremely important. One of the things that I've noticed is, we've always known the municipal market in the US tends to have indenture requirements that require debt service reserve funds at about 12 months or more in many cases. And that is something that has proven quite strong. And then there's discretionary levels of liquidity maintained by management, which actually has also proven quite valuable versus project financings, which are many of them done in the bank markets, that tend to have 6 months of liquidity. And that's proven to be more of a challenge. So to give you a few snapshots, these are the turnpikes in the US. The scale on the left is, 10 times debt service in 2020. Clearly, some of them have tremendous amounts of liquidity. The ones on the right end of the scale have less. But even there, because if you look at the scale, you will realize that they have 2 to 3 times liquidity for their current debt service. So the concerns aren't there. Clearly, the ITR concession on the end has the least amount of liquidity, given it only has a 6 months debt service reserve fund. You see a similar pattern with the expressways and monopolistic bridge systems. Clearly, the ones on the left have more liquidity, not just required liquidity, but discretionary liquidity. The ones on the right have some constraints. One thing to think about is the number itself is not the issue. One has to think about that in the context of the obligations of the entity. So just because something is lower does not mean it's bad. It has to be thought about in terms of the ability to maintain operations and stable finance. Similar numbers for small network systems. The scale here is actually 20 times, so they look smaller, but most of these have a significant amount of liquidity. And then you look at managed lanes. The ones on the left have, many of them still have liquidity that's tied up from ramp up reserves and other things. The ones on the right have a little less, but we know they've been performing, until the crisis, they've been performing pretty well. And that actually is a strength for when they come out, when the economy recovers. So just to give you a quick sense on ratings actions, I wanted to point out all 3 major sectors. All of you are quite familiar with what's going on in the airport sector. And as a result, you will not be surprised to see 92% of airports globally are on some form of negative action, 8% are unstable, and 17% have had some severe action. Interestingly, and this is a point made by Donna about, when you talk about seaports, you're talking about goods and containers and moving them around. This, unlike any other recession, has shown freight does not get affected as much by coronavirus, except for supply chain disruptions and other things that have been an issue. And as a result, they've actually performed almost as well as toll roads, which is interesting. Clearly, there's an aspect to seaports, which is freight, which has been positive, but also has affected toll roads, where toll road truck traffic has held up. Again, and points that have been made by the prior presenters. Clearly, our expectation all along is that in a domestic crisis such as this, particularly when the economy contracts, toll roads and toll traffic has always performed better than the others. So this is not unlike that, except for the fact that seaports have been better. To give you a snapshot, it's been global. You can see transactions that have been downgraded in Latin America, in Europe, and even one in the US, the Dulles Greenway. But it's not all negative. The data, even in a crisis, tells you different things. Clearly, Shenzhen Expressway has recovered because of they were early into the crisis. Their numbers they are open, they're operating. The numbers are better, so we've reverted that to stable. And then the management actions are extremely important in a crisis. And both Pennsylvania Turnpike, South Jersey, I know we talked about Turnpike already, they have been reverted to stable, mainly because of the actions of management. And one can't ignore the fact that regardless of what's going on, one has to think about the long term. And you look at a managed lane and you would ask, why did you put a managed lane on positive outlook in a crisis? Because we know the strength of these assets. And we know this one has been outperforming prior to the crisis. We were seeing the data. It would probably have been put on positive outlook. Anyway, we know what things are in the short term are a problem, but there's liquidity to deal with that. So we're not concerned about it. So we assigned a positive. So I'll just leave this. This slide basically talks about each of the subsets and the fact that the outlooks and where they are. You will get a copy of the presentation so you can follow through on that. And then the last thing to mention is these stress test reports. We've got 13 of them done across airports, toll roads, and seaports globally. 5 of them are related to toll roads, and they're here and they're available. If you need copies, this next page just shows you a snapshot of the first page, and really the paragraph at the bottom on the right end tells you everything you need to know about what the impact will be given those 2 bookends that I talked about. With that, I'll hand it back to Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Cherry, and that was a terrific overview of the credit impacts that COVID-19 has put on toll agencies globally. Our next speaker actually, is a traffic and revenue consultant is really the one who will be looking at, what this all meant and what this will all mean to traffic on toll roads in the future. To date, there has been, during this time period, one action with a brand new traffic and revenue study for the E470 Public Highway Authority done by CDM Smith. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Cameron Kahn to talk about how the traffic and revenue consultant community is looking at the impacts of COVID-19. Cameron?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. You'll see my screen?
Yep, you're good to go.
So I thought what we would do is first maybe take a look at what the current trends are that we're seeing through end of June. We've been monitoring over 15, 16 facilities. 15 facilities in the US, a cross-section of toll facilities, both large, medium, and small, serving different markets. And these are benchmarked against the first week of March. And I will point out that they're not seasonally adjusted, as there are some facilities that are in this index that are more responsive to recreational and seasonal impacts than others. But you can see here that we hit a bottom around the end of March, middle of April, where on average, toll road traffic was down around 60%. We've also highlighted within this grouping some of the ranges that we were seeing there, and within that you can see some facilities were actually bottomed out at around lost around 70-75% or more traffic. So some general takeaways from this. Some of the larger systems have shown a lot more resilience. And that may be related to the type of traffic that they facilitate, more interstate traffic, carrying larger volumes of commercial traffic, and having a more diverse portfolio of roadways and a more diverse customer base. In contrast, we saw that some of the smaller systems were more adversely impacted. Again, many of them are shorter in terms of distance. They're located in urban areas. And particularly during the pandemic period where there were travel restrictions, there were more alternative local routes and toll-free expressways. And they also speak to some of the customer base that they were reliant on, whether it be a high proportion of airport traffic or certain special generators, recreational type of facilities. This next slide really shows the trend for commercial vehicles. And as has been mentioned, commercial vehicles were less impacted and have remained pretty strong through this period. We did see a dip in usage again around the mid-April period, but we've seen again steady climb back through end of June, and in some cases it's coming within 5% of normal traffic. Now, managed lanes, on the other hand, and this is data through May, have been really adversely impacted, and we've seen traffic levels drop to around 80%, and now we're beginning to see in this particular chart a slight recovery. And that's not surprising. Their usage is predicated on the congestion levels on the adjacent lanes, and when there's no congestion, there's little need for a congestion reliever at that point. So, but we did also note that there was an incremental, I mean, this is down by 80%, but there was an incremental negative impact with respect to revenue as well. So I want to talk about next is within this environment, how have we, as traffic and revenue consultants, have we adapted our traffic and revenue forecasts within this period of uncertainty as this has gone on? And I'll say throughout this process, it's been a process of learning as we've gone along, from seeing these unprecedented declines and the social environment changing so rapidly to things that we never thought would be happening, to things that we're now living through today. So I want to use the E470 investment grade study, sort of illustrative of what our approach was and how it actually evolved over time. So this was a typical investment grade study. It was initiated around September of 2019, and we had included all the elements of the study. And we were around March 12th, I actually made a presentation to the board with our draft findings, and there were some actions to be taken subsequent to that. So just around that period, and I remember it vividly because I was at the airport around March 11th. I think the announcement was made that we were living in a global pandemic. COVID-19 was global pandemic was announced. And it kind of made me wonder what I was actually doing there, traveling within that environment. Anyway, a lot of things were changing rapidly at that moment in time. And we also began to see a big financial meltdown. The stock market was crashing, and I think Michael and others can maybe comment on this. The bond transaction deals were sort of halted, or sort of ground to a halt at that moment in time. So our study was, to an extent, the deal was sort of momentarily put to a halt because there wasn't much market activity at that time. But we recognized we couldn't continue and kind of go with the study based on what we had prepared to the market as and when it would open up again. So one of the key things for us was to continue to monitor what was actually happening with this asset. We thought it would be important to better understand what was happening with respect to performance, because we knew that investors would ask the question, what's happening on your facility? And we wanted to include as much data within the report so we can actually demonstrate what was happening. And then also use that as a basis for developing our forecasts that we knew we also needed to modify. And we were also, at the time, given this uncertainty, hoping that when we were ready to go to market, that we would see a positive recovery, that some kind of a positive slope reoccurring in terms of traffic performance, so we could say things were improving, and this is what the actual bottom is at the worst moment in time. So we looked at a lot of, we studied a lot of different data sources, and this has been through this whole period a period of learning and trying to draw on as many different data sources as we could. And a good friend and colleague of mine, Hugh Miller, has said we've become epidemiologists in terms of trying to study how this coronavirus pandemic is going to play out, but then also trying to understand how it is affecting public policy, how that is affecting some of the travel restrictions, some of the state mandates that were made, and the different phases of reopenings that are now being implemented. And we use all these data points to develop basically a lot of different scenarios, because it was uncertain how this would play out. But we are beginning to see, obviously now, as we've had more information and some of the states are coming out of this, more data to help inform us. So one of the key things for us when there is uncertainty, and I would say, traffic and revenue by its nature is always challenging, but when you add COVID-19, it throws in a whole level of uncertainty. And so our approach to that is to develop a lot of different scenarios that will be able to help stress how this asset will perform under different type of travel restrictions. So we considered, the stay-at-home orders, what dates they applied to. We considered the duration, and we developed different severity impacts or recovery rates associated with this COVID-19 period. We developed a fairly disaggregate data set where we took 2 years of data and disaggregated it on a week-by-week basis using seasonal factors, and then applied these COVID-19 impacts to a normalized growth profile to get a better understanding of how that could, what the net results would be. And this is an illustrative example of something that we use. Now, we had assumed in this particular case that the primary impact would be through the end of the year. And right now in red, it really is illustrative of both the COVID and economic and sort of the travel behavior changes that we're seeing. And then beyond 21, we assumed that there would be lingering residual impacts related to the economic slowdown and adaptation to travel behavior. We're all sort of working in a new environment. What was telecommuting for a small number of people is now we're living that on a larger basis. So our next slide shows another scenario that we developed, which reflects a second wave potentially occurring after the first in the December time frame, and reflecting how that would potentially impact the normalized traffic. As a result of this, we were then able to overlay these impacts onto our normalized traffic forecast. The black line is really what we would have assumed had there been no COVID, and the dashed line shows the impacts of COVID applied to the forecast. And the dotted line shows the impact of the second wave applied to the normalized forecast. And in both cases, you can see it results in obviously a big significant impact in 2020, but then it results in a lag in terms of when you would return back to even the 2019 levels. So under the first wave, we come back around the 2023 timeframe back to the 2019 levels. And for the second wave, it's even further from that. So I will say this was a very collaborative process working with the E470 staff. And I really want to give kudos both to Tim Stewart and Jason Myers and the finance team that were part of this. It was a very iterative process. We developed these forecasts. They took those forecasts and conducted their own financial stress tests. And they actually modified their financial plan based on what they saw were several of these different scenario tests that we had developed. Now, I will say, just as was mentioned by Cherian and Donna and others, that there was, it's this extremely well managed toll agency, and they had significant debt service reserve funds and liquidity. So that was also obviously a key part of them securing the issuance of the bond offering, which closed recently in June. So what I wanted to say here is our approach to this continues to evolve as we get more and more data. I don't think we can be just say that this is how we're going to do it. We always want to be absorbing the best and latest and greatest information from different data sources in terms of how this pandemic is playing out and how we can potentially trigger travel restrictions. And we're seeing this right now play out in some of the hotspots in Texas and Florida, where things have changed very quickly. So this is very dynamic in terms of how it is affecting society and our responses to that. So, so as part of this, I think we need to be very flexible and continue to use these scenario planning tools, leveraging the latest and greatest data that is available. All right, Michael, that's it. Thanks.
Cameron, thank you so much. And our last speaker will give the perspective of a private sector toll road operator and investor. So Ricardo.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. And yeah, being the last one, I knew I had to be brief. So I'll try to make it quick for us to have a few minutes for Q&A, which I think it's relevant and important. I mean, let me start with just a little brief note on performance of our assets in North America, of Cintra's assets in North America. Well, I'm not going to say anything that you haven't heard in the previous presentations. The worst was, the first week of April, with decreases ranging from 60 to 76% of the traffic volumes on our assets. Light vehicles were more affected than trucks. They saw more resilience, as it's also been explained in other assets. And recovery started in late April, early May. Unfortunately, I'm not able to share with you where we are now, because being a listed company, we are going to be presenting results, Q2 results, in a couple of weeks. But obviously, the evolution is not much different to what you've been seeing. Also, important to say that we also had to adapt our OPEX, reducing non-essential expenditures, better managing our contracts, and always always keeping in mind that our first or most important element to keep during these days was the safety of our employees and the safety and the quality of service for our users. With the CapEx investment, as it's also been explained, those ones that could be deferred in order to save some cost, they have been done. My next slide is on how does the recovery look like? And I think I'm going to touch base on a couple of things that luckily after 5 presentations, I don't think anyone has touched. Or one is on the top, you see, this is for one of our projects, levels of congestion. And as one of the panelists already said, we were doing great, March was, well, the level of usage, the level of mobility in our corridors was big. That was creating quite a lot of congestion on our alternative roads. This is from one of our managed lanes. Look what happened at the end of March. Congestion vanished, it just disappeared. Everything is green there. You can see the peak hours. And now by the end of June, we are starting to see some signs of recovery. Obviously nothing as in March, as what we were seeing in March, but still there is some light out there. And another interesting element is what I've got on the bottom part of the slide with I think, it's been said that light vehicles, they've done way better than trucks. You can see that there, the yellow line is what happened in March. Dark gray, it's what happens at the end of June, and light gray, what happens before, the pre-COVID conditions. You can see the first two are lights and heavies. Then what happens here is interesting. Lights, they've recovered, as you can see, in the off-peak hours and mainly the PM peak hours. However, still the AM peak hours is lagging. And that's one of the things that I'll be touching next, which is, well, is the impact of the work from home order. Or work from home, that people is working from home. And so, AM peak activities are significantly lower than what we were used to see. However, then people in the PM peaks, at least so far, till the end of June, they were doing pretty well, and you can see that the losses there were not that massive. Regarding trucks, as it's been said, they suffer less. You can see that the yellow curve doesn't go as low as in the lights, and they've recovered almost the original levels. And what I've got on the last chart is what we call the highway is the sum of the free lanes plus the managed lanes. These two traffics are this chart is related to managed lanes, and there it's very similar to the picture that has been put in many of the presentations, that is still lagging in some of the periods, but most of the volumes have been recovered at a great pace. What could be the post-COVID impact? I've seen some of the questions, regarding this. Obviously, there will be an economic recession that was touched by Chirian, and by different panelists. That's going to have an impact on the traffic volumes for sure. I'm not going to dig into that. Then I think it's important the long-lasting behavioral changes that may occur now. Well, we've been doing research, and we are going to launch a few more research initiatives on these elements. Like what's going to happen with increased adoption of work from home. It's work from home here to stay or not, So, well, that may have a negative impact, particularly as we are seeing in commuting trips in peak hours. What about growth of e-commerce activity? E-commerce, it's growing, and e-commerce has it's a double sword edge, at some point it generates less personal trips that normally occur on low value period. Let's say when people go shopping, but at the same time, it generates more high value delivery trips, so all these vans and trucks that participate in e-commerce. So what is going to be the balance? We don't know, but we'll need to be taking care of it. And then the social distancing practices. Honestly, we think most of them won't be long lasting, but for sure, there are a few that have already been observed either in the US or in other parts of the world, like increase in private car usage and less carpooling, less usage of ride-hailing services. That should have a positive impact, on congestion and on the toll road sector. Then staycation, this term that I first heard in the 2008-2009 recession, when But people, instead of flying, they take their car, you know, to to get their vacation nearby or on road trips. That will also generate more car traffic. And then what's going to happen with the reductions in recreational or leisure trips? As I was showing before, we've seen high and rapid recoveries of PM peak hours. So the same, we think that once all the conditions recover, that wouldn't be like a big impact. And then regarding the new business opportunities for us as private investors, we think that obviously the lack of public funds for infra, it's still there, and it will be even more acute with the state debts increasing significantly. We expect them, or we think they will need to look or tap into all available sources. One of them would be or should be the private sector, you know, to develop new projects. Then obviously for us also being in a good liquidity position in our projects and as a company, as Chirian was showing in his slides, we think there may be also opportunities for looking at assets or at operators that are in bigger problems. So I'm gonna leave it here. You know, we still have some time for questions. So I'll pass it on to Tim.
Hey, Michael, we seem to have you muted.
So sorry. Thank you, Ricardo. I appreciate that overview. And I had a few prepared questions I was going to ask to the panelists, but I think given the timing, I wanted to dive into a couple of the ones that were sent in by the audience. And so I think one of the questions is, and you touched on this a little bit, Ricardo, but the transition from public transit to passenger vehicles as it relates to the virus's impact on that, but also the use of driving versus flying, and what impact that may have here, at least in the near term. Maybe Cameron, you can take that question first.
Yeah, so I think with respect to the change in mode from flying to driving, I think we're seeing that right now in terms of behaviors. I mean, March 12th was the last time I was on an airplane, and I don't plan on going on a plane anytime soon. So we're seeing that. I think we're going to see some positive impacts, particularly to the larger toll roads and certainly facilities like Donna's, the Parkway. You're seeing that big bump of people just needing to get away, but something within a 2, 3, 4 hour drive. I think you're going to see a lot of that. And then with respect to, until there's an actual vaccine, there is going to be uncertainty and unease with the traveling public. And so you are going to continue to see where there is a choice that people will probably prefer to use passenger cars. And I think we're going to see, and that's why we're not going to see a quick recovery in mass transit unless it's really ultimately a need to use that as an only mode choice.
Great, thank you. That was a good perspective on that. I mean, related to that telecommuting, is there a sense, and maybe Cherian, you can dive in on this one relative to the credit impacts of even beyond when we have a virus, a lot of people have gotten used to working from home and kind of like it. And we may see a transition to more and more people working from home. How do you look at the long-term credit impacts of that, Cherian?
Yeah, so one thing to think about is, when you're in the middle of a crisis, you are probably not best able to gauge long-term trends. Data which Ricardo and Cameron would look at will tell us that. When I look at the longer-term trends, and a key assumption is that there'll be a vaccine. I tend to think we will go back to doing a lot of the things that we did, maybe a little differently. So yes, volumes will be lower, right? But congestion is not something that's going away. Roadway capacity is still constrained, particularly in large major metropolitan areas. As a result, it'll just be a question of when you get back to the same levels of congestion. And yes, behaviors will change. So things that, again, Ricardo mentioned, you will end up having different unanticipated impacts in the off-peaks, right? So I tend to think that yes, the telecommuting will have an impact, but particularly for stronger assets, which have large, sitting in large geographically and demographically diverse communities, the roads there will have more strength, right? And clearly then we'll have to see what. The issue with transit, I tend to think, there's a large portion of the population with limited incomes, and they will need to use transit. So while there is a short-term problem with transit, I think at some point transit will recover because it has to.
Great. Actually, I did have one prepared question I want to ask because I was interested. Ricardo, you touched on managed or express lanes, and I am kind of interested since they have, obviously been impacted more because they're used to fight congestion, and when there's no congestion, less of an incentive to pay a toll. But we have been seeing, anecdotally, I've been hearing a lot of express lanes are still seeing a decent amount of traffic, even with the general purpose lanes being free flowing, just due to predictability and reliability of the trip and all of that. But do you think that express lanes, all of this, does that change your thoughts on the fundamentals of investing in express lanes? And particularly, looking at Texas, where most of your assets are located.
Yeah, I think it's pretty much what I mean. Our view is pretty much what Tyrion was just saying, which is obviously things are bad now, things are recovering. There will be different impacts, different behavioral changes that may apply in the future. But after a few years, we should get back to pretty similar congestion conditions as we were before. So the need for projects like express lanes, like managed lanes, it still will be there, and as you were saying, Mike, I mean, even now during this period, there is usage of managed lanes. The chart that Cameron was showing, that obviously they suffer more than other projects, but still you could see there was a 20% of current traffic when there was no congestion on any of the networks. So that means that users value those projects and that they at least they like them. Then for sure in the future they will be needed. And regarding Texas, we think that it's diverse. It has a diverse economy, particularly the area where we are, where most of our projects are, and so that's it's still growing. Population we expect it, to keep on growing. So in this environment and with a lot of congestion as it had and hopefully will have soon again, we think it's still a focus for us.
Great, thank you. So I want to keep this going for a few more minutes because we have some other interesting questions. Amy Potter, unfortunately, has to cut out due to a board meeting, an important task for any public agency official. So I'm going to say goodbye to Amy and thank her for her participation. But for anyone who wants to stick on for another 5 or 10 minutes, I have a couple more questions before we conclude. But again, Amy, thank you so much for your insight and your participation in this session.
Thank you.
With that, I'm going to actually ask Donna a question that came up in the audience, but also was one of our prepared questions, which is, did the impacts of the virus change the timeline at all for the authorities, contemplation of where you're headed with cashless tolling? Obviously, you're a ticketed system and, Easy Pass, et cetera, but has this changed anything relative to that timeline?
No, it hasn't, Michael. Actually, the thing that's changed it is the adoption of our long-range capital plan and our toll increase. So that conversion to tolls by mail, video tolling, is part of the capital projects that are in that list. But we never had a definitive date, and COVID is not accelerating that date. Unlike the Pennsylvania Turnpike, which was already well into it, and then decided to accelerate it by a year. We're not there. But as I said, so I don't believe COVID is changing that.
Great. Okay. Well, that's good to know for sure. And we hosted a webinar a couple of weeks ago through the bond buyer, and one of the participants was Brian Mayhew from the Bay Area Toll Authority, who basically said it was up to him. He'd get rid of electronic tollings because he doesn't like having to deal with violators. So definitely a lot of points of view on that concept. So Eric, based on the UBS Evidence Lab data, do you think the US can learn where we might be headed based on Asia and European data that's come in already?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, this is my opinion and not UBS's, but clearly I think some of the interconnectedness that has allowed this pandemic to transpire also applies to transportation, right? It shouldn't be a surprise that if the regions across a country are in different stages in terms of their mobility restrictions, there's going to be effects of mobility restriction in one part of the country affecting other parts of the country. So I think just the nature of our federalist system and lots of different localities being at different stages or having different views about mobility restrictions is presumably hindering the US. I mean, you do see a difference even between the US and Canada, but you have to ask the question, why is Germany recovering or why is New Zealand recovering? And clearly, being on the same page across the country, has some sort of impact. Obviously, there's a big connection between public health and the mobility restrictions here. So clearly, the fact that we've regressed along or regressed some way is impacting the recovery in the US. But I think it really boils down to, transportation is a national issue. And if it's not nationally aligned in terms of the restrictions, it's going to have impacts. That's why we have regional mobility authorities in some places instead of, planning county by county and so on. So interconnectedness matters, and the fact that we have disparate policy decisions is impacting presumably traffic.
Great, thank you, Eric. Cameron, obviously it's impossible to 100% accurately predict the future, but I was interested in the E470 TNR report that you did do a second wave scenario in there in terms of looking what the impacts of the resurgence of the virus might have. However, right now we're starting to see hotspots occur, and hitting record levels of the illness in certain states, that one might consider to be part of the first wave. How do you think about how traffic and revenue might be impacted, based on a more prolonged impact of the virus going forward?
Well, as I said, we're monitoring performance on a daily basis, if not weekly basis, within these regions. And we're very cognizant of some of the events that are going on there. I was reviewing a project last week where we had pulled statistics which showed the number of ICU beds that were available. Just to, not that we're going to predict how many people are going to use those ICU beds, but just to let us, to give a sense of, will that region potentially go into some kind of lockdown as a result of that? And so that forms part of one of our scenarios to say there may potentially be a resurgence into this. These are all what I would say short-term impacts. Right now, the long-term models are what they are. We are consulting with our independent economists for them to try and give us opinions in terms of how this is changing. But there's just so much uncertainty around this. And I think we're going to have to, like any major shock, as Cherian alluded to, you have to wait to see how things settle out and do these become permanent changes in travel behavior, which then you would want to reflect. I think from the short-term perspective, we're doing our, we've tried to factor those subtle points in, like there may be changes in travel, telecommuting, a higher percentage of people working from home. And those are sort of implicit in what we've projected. And, you know, we've tried to take a conservative course here that what this is resulting in is actually a lag in future growth by maybe 3-4 years.
Great. Well, I'm afraid that we've run out of time. Again, great presentations by everyone. I certainly would like to thank all the panelists for your insightful thoughts on the financial effects of a new travel and commuting landscape on toll agencies. And while no one out there, as I mentioned, has a crystal ball, people and freight still need to get from place to place. So there will always be a role for toll roads in this country and internationally, and that offers hope for the other side of the pandemic. But before we go, I'm going to ask all the panelists to offer one word that describes how they have felt during the past 4 months. For me, the word is resilience. Donna?
My word is grateful.
Eric?
Reflective.
Cherian?
Teamwork.
Cameron?
I would say gratitude, similar to Donna.
Ricardo?
I would say uncertainty.
There you go. So again, thanks to all the panelists, and also to Pat Jones and Wanda Clayman and Kristen Bromberg, the behind the scenes person for IBTTA. And on behalf of all of my colleagues at UBS, including Eric and actually Connor Lance, who work behind the scenes for us here at UBS, as well as our other transportation group members, Chris Bergstrom, Amanda Parker, Tiffany Ye, and Dana Kahn. We want to thank all of the participants in the audience for your time and your consideration for the discussion around this important topic. And with that, I'll say, have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.